$300 million of Burkina Faso's gold has been frozen in Europe, and this single act could set off a global showdown. Burkina Faso was counting on that gold to build its future, schools, hospitals, and roads. But now it's stuck in Europe, blocked under the excuse of sanctions and rules. To many, this feels like history repeating itself, Africa's wealth taken and held hostage abroad. For President Ibrahim Traoré, it's not just about money, it's about sovereignty. But with Donald Trump attacking global institutions and the IMF looming in the background, the question is clear. Who really controls Burkina Faso's gold and Africa's future? We will analyze this and more in today's video. The story begins not in Africa, but in Europe. At a quiet shipping port, containers filled with gold bars sit under heavy guard. They were supposed to be on their way to Burkina Faso. Instead, they are frozen, trapped by European authorities who cite sanctions and international compliance. To the outside world, this may sound like a technical issue, just another bureaucratic delay. But for Burkina Faso, this was no small matter. The gold was worth more than $300 million. It was not just metal, it was the nation's future. That gold was meant to be exchanged for medicine, fuel, and development projects that millions of citizens depend on. The news hit the capital, Ouagadougou, like a lightning bolt. Radio stations buzzed, social media exploded. People gathered in markets and tea shops, whispering about betrayal. Many said openly what officials avoided. They have stolen our gold. The anger was not only about this shipment. It touched on something deeper, a history that stretched back centuries. From the time of colonial rule, Africa's wealth has always seemed to flow outwards. Gold, diamonds, cocoa, oil, taken from the soil, sent abroad, and controlled by outsiders. For the people of Burkina Faso, the frozen gold was not just about money. It was a painful reminder that the chains of exploitation had never fully been broken. President Ibrahim Traoré, only in power for a short time, had promised a new beginning. He had told his people that Africa must stand on its own, free from the grip of France, Europe, and the West. The gold, in many ways, was part of that promise. It symbolized a future where Burkina Faso could decide its own destiny. But now, locked away in a European vault, that promise seemed under attack. International media reported the story with cold detachment. Headlines in Western outlets described it as expected, even routine. They reminded readers that Burkina Faso, along with Mali and Niger, had broken away from the West and aligned itself with Russia. To them, the frozen gold was simply the cost of defiance. But inside Burkina Faso, the story felt far more personal. Families who struggled to afford food and medicine asked why their nation's wealth was being held hostage. Young men, who had been inspired by Traoré's fiery speeches about dignity and independence, saw this as another humiliation. And soldiers, already fighting brutal insurgencies in the Sahel, wondered if the gold had been blocked to weaken their nation's defenses. The symbolism was powerful. Containers of African gold sitting idle in Europe, while Africans themselves struggled for survival. To many, it felt like history repeating itself, only this time with different faces and modern excuses. Traoré's supporters wasted no time. They filled social media with defiant messages. "Our gold will return," one viral post read. Others accused the IMF and the West of using the frozen shipment as a weapon to force Burkina Faso back into dependence. Even among ordinary citizens, there was a sense that this was no accident. It was a message, a warning, yet there was also fear. What if the gold never returned? What if Burkina Faso's young leader, already under pressure from insurgents and foreign powers, could not deliver on his promises? The frozen gold was more than a crisis of finance. It was a crisis of faith. Faith in the government, faith in independence, faith in the future. As the story spread, one question grew louder. Was this just about sanctions? Or was this a deliberate act to break Burkina Faso's spirit before it could rise? From the very first days of his rule, President Ibrahim Traoré made one thing clear. His fight was about sovereignty, not just independence on paper, but real, tangible freedom, the kind that cannot be dictated by Paris, Brussels, or Washington. When he expelled French troops from Burkina Faso, it sent shockwaves across the Sahel. For decades, France had called itself a partner in the fight against terrorism. But for many Burkinabe, that partnership looked more like occupation. French bases sat on their soil, yet violence only grew worse. Traoré's message was blunt. If foreign armies cannot protect us, they have no reason to stay. He didn't stop there. One by one, he tore up colonial-era agreements that had tied Burkina Faso's economy to France. He called out Western institutions, accusing them of using loans and aid as tools of control. He spoke to his people in simple words, promising them dignity, promising them that their future would no longer be written in foreign capitals. So when the news broke that $300 million of Burkina Faso's gold was frozen in Europe, it was more than just a financial crisis. It was a direct challenge to everything Traoré had built his reputation on. In the streets of Ouagadougou, supporters looked to him for answers. Would he fight? Would he cave? For Traoré, retreat was not an option. At a rally, standing before thousands of young men and women waving Burkina Faso's red and green flag, he raised his fist and spoke words that echoed across the nation. Africa will never be free if our wealth is held hostage abroad. We will not kneel. We will not beg. Our resources belong to us. The crowd erupted. For many, his words carried the weight of history. They remembered the assassinated leader Thomas Sankara, who once said Africa must stop begging for its own resources. Sankara had been silenced in the 1980s, but Traoré was reviving that same spirit of defiance. Western media dismissed his statements as anti-Western rhetoric. But inside Africa, his defiance struck a chord. In Mali and Niger, his allies in the alliance of Sahel states, leaders echoed his anger. They too had faced blocked aid, frozen assets, and international isolation. To them, this was not just Burkina Faso's fight, it was a fight for the whole region. Traoré doubled down. He told his ministers that Burkina Faso would not depend on anyone who held their resources hostage. He called for tighter bonds with Russia, China, and other non-Western partners who promised to treat Africa as an equal. Some of his critics warned that this path was dangerous, that it could trigger harsher sanctions. But Traoré's answer was simple. If freedom comes with a price, then we are ready to pay it. Behind closed doors, his government began exploring alternatives. Could the gold be rerouted through friendly nations? Could new financial systems be built outside the reach of Western banks? Could alliances like BRICS offer a shield against the IMF and European control? The young president, often seen in his military fatigues, became a symbol of resistance not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa. His image appeared on posters, murals, and online campaigns calling him the son of Sankara, a leader who dared to speak when others stayed silent. But with every word of defiance, the stakes grew higher. The IMF was watching. Western governments were taking note, and even allies like Trump, unpredictable and opportunistic, could turn against him at any moment. Still, Traoré stood firm. For him, this wasn't about one shipment of gold. It was about the soul of Africa, about whether his nation would remain a pawn in the global game or finally rise as a player in its own right. As the chants of his supporters filled the streets, sovereignty or death, one thing became clear. Traoré was not backing down. The frozen gold may have been locked in Europe, but in Burkina Faso, the fire of defiance was burning brighter than ever. But the drama deepens. Across the Atlantic, another storm is brewing. One with the same enemy, but a very different agenda. Donald Trump, the US president and a fiery political force once again, has been thundering against global institutions. At rallies packed with supporters, his words are sharp and unforgiving. He accuses the IMF, the World Bank, and the European Union of exploiting weaker nations, draining them for profit and enriching global elites. For many Americans, this message resonates with his America First campaign. But in Ouagadougou and across Africa, Trump's rhetoric is being watched closely. Could this unlikely figure, a billionaire businessman, a populist politician, become an unexpected ally in Africa's fight for sovereignty? In small cafes and dusty market stalls, young Burkinabe debate the question. Some see Trump as a hammer that could smash the old financial order. They argue that his disdain for the IMF and the United Nations might align, however briefly, with Traoré's mission to break free from Western control. If Trump hates the IMF and we hate the IMF, maybe we can stand together, one student told a local reporter. But others are far more cautious. They remember that Trump is not known for charity. His philosophy has always been transactional. Deals, leverage, pressure. He may speak against the global order, but always with America's benefit in mind. For Africa, there is a real fear. What if Burkina Faso becomes just another card in his high-stakes game? Political analysts draw sharp contrast between the two men. Traore, the young soldier president in fatigues, calling for African dignity. Trump, the seasoned showman, obsessed with American power and personal victory. And yet, their enemies overlap. Both rail against global institutions that have long held the upper hand. Both denounce what they call the arrogance of elites in Brussels, Paris, and New York. Both claim to stand for the people against a corrupt system. In Washington, whispers grow louder. If Trump secures power again, could his administration reshape U.S. policy toward Africa? Would he support countries like Burkina Faso that resist IMF influence? Or would he pressure them into one-sided deals favoring American companies? In Ouagadougou, the debate is just as fierce. Some of Traore's advisors quietly suggest exploring contact with Trump's circle. Others warn against it, arguing that relying on Trump could taint Burkina Faso's image as a truly independent power. After all, Trump's America First policy does not mean Africa First. On social media, comparisons fly. Memes show Traore and Trump side by side, fists raised against the IMF. But in the comments, the divide is clear. Traore is fighting for Africa. Trump is fighting for himself. One post reads. Another replies, "It doesn't matter. If their enemies are the same, they can work together." The frozen gold becomes the perfect symbol of this uneasy overlap. For Traore, it is a battle for sovereignty. For Trump, it is evidence of a corrupt system that must be torn down. But their goals, their motives, could not be more different. And so the question hangs in the air. Could Burkina Faso and Trump's America form a strange alliance against the IMF and Europe? Or would such a partnership only lead to new traps, with Africa once again playing a supporting role in someone else's game of power? For now, nothing is certain. But one thing is clear. The showdown over Burkina Faso's gold is no longer just about Africa. It is pulling in voices and players from across the world, and Donald Trump may soon become one of its loudest. Meanwhile, the IMF watches silently but carefully. Its name is rarely shouted on the streets, yet its presence is felt in every African household. For decades, the International Monetary Fund has been the invisible hand shaping Africa's economic destiny. On paper, the IMF exists to stabilize struggling nations. It offers loans, aid packages, and financial expertise. But in reality, those loans come with conditions. Governments are forced to cut subsidies, raise taxes, privatize state companies, and open their markets to foreign investors. In short, they must play by rules written in Washington and Brussels. Across Africa, the results have been devastating. Farmers lose protections, food prices rise, public services shrink, and local industries collapse under foreign competition. Entire nations become trapped in cycles of debt, always owing, never free. It is no wonder many Africans call the IMF not a helper, but a jailer. Burkina Faso knows this story all too well. For years, its budgets were shaped not in Ouagadougou, but in distant IMF offices. Leaders were told what to cut, what to sell, what to sacrifice. Even independence itself seemed like a mirage, because every move depended on approval from international creditors. Now, with $300 million of gold frozen in Europe, whispers grow louder. Was this simply a sanction, or was it something more? Could this be the IMF's hidden hand at work, using financial pressure to force Traore back into line? Analysts point out the timing. The Sahel alliance of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had just declared independence from Western security and economic structures. They had expelled French troops, turned toward Russia, and begun speaking of new partnerships with China. Such bold defiance did not go unnoticed. The IMF's silence is telling. No condemnation, no defense, just quiet observation. But to many, that silence feels heavy, like the calm before a storm. Inside Burkina Faso, suspicion runs deep. On local radio shows, commentators warn that the frozen gold is not an accident. This is leverage, one host insists. They want to bring us back under their control. If we obey, they release it. If we resist, they keep it. For President Traoré, this is the heart of the struggle. To yield would mean betraying his promise of sovereignty, but to resist could mean deeper isolation, harsher sanctions, and an even fiercer economic war. The irony is bitter. The IMF was created to prevent economic collapse. But in Africa, it often feels like the IMF thrives on it. By keeping nations in debt, it ensures they remain dependent, always looking outward for rescue, never free to stand on their own. Now, with the gold frozen, the stakes have never been higher. Some advisors argue that Burkina Faso should negotiate, make temporary concessions, and secure the release of its wealth. Others insist this is the moment to walk away entirely, to reject the IMF and Western financial systems, and instead build new networks with Russia, China, and BRICS nations. It is a dangerous gamble. Leaving the IMF's orbit could open new opportunities, but it could also shut Burkina Faso out of global markets altogether. Already the country faces insurgencies, poverty, and a fragile economy. Can it truly afford to fight the world's most powerful financial institutions head-on? Yet Traoré's supporters argue the opposite. They say the country cannot afford not to fight, because every year spent under IMF control is another year of chains. And if Burkina Faso does not break those chains now, then when? But this isn't just Burkina Faso. It's Mali. It's Niger. It's the alliance of Sahel states, the AES. Three nations bound together, not by convenience, but by survival. For years, each of these countries fought alone. Each one faced insurgencies, economic pressure, and constant interference from outside powers. But after their military governments came to power, something changed. They began to speak with one voice. They declared that they were tired of the old system, the endless cycle of dependence, aid, and betrayal. The formation of the AES was a turning point. Together, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso rejected ECOWAS, the West African bloc often seen as tied to Western interests. Together, they expelled French troops, forcing Paris to end decades of military dominance in the region. Together, they began charting a new course, one that did not pass through Paris, Brussels, or Washington. But sovereignty is not declared once. It is tested every day, and the frozen gold has become one of those tests. Because to many observers, this crisis is not about compliance or sanctions. It is about punishment, a warning shot fired at the AES. If you break away from the West, there will be consequences. And yet, the AES leaders do not seem shaken. In Bamako, Mali's capital, officials echo Traoré's anger. In Niamey, Niger's leaders speak of dignity and independence. They argue that the gold crisis proves exactly what they have been saying all along, that Africa's resources are never truly safe when they are tied to Western systems. Instead, the AES is looking eastward, toward Russia, which offers military support without lectures, toward China, which brings infrastructure and trade without political conditions, to BRICS, the rising bloc of nations promising a new financial order outside the dollar. This is why the frozen gold matters. It is not just about Burkina Faso's money, it is about a bigger question. Who writes the rules of tomorrow's world? Will it still be the West, clinging to old power through sanctions and institutions like the IMF? Or will Africa, together with new allies, finally build a system where it is treated as an equal? On the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, ordinary people see the frozen gold as proof that their leaders are right, that the West does not want independent Africa, only a dependent one. They march with banners that read, "Sovereignty or Death," chanting against France, against Europe, and against the IMF. But in Western capitals, the picture looks very different. Officials describe the AES leaders as reckless military men, dragging their countries into isolation. They warn that Russia and China are not saviors, but opportunists waiting to seize Africa's resources for themselves. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but one thing is certain: the frozen gold has lit a fire, and that fire is spreading beyond the Sahel. From Ghana to Senegal, from Guinea to Chad, young Africans are watching. They are asking whether their countries too should break free from the old chains. The West sees instability, the AES sees opportunity. And both sides understand that what happens in this battle will not remain local. It could reshape Africa's role in the world for decades to come. The frozen gold is not the end of the story. It is the spark. And sparks, when they fall on dry ground, can ignite something much larger, something impossible to contain. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.